So this time it took us 40 some minutes to get to this is not investment advice.
If you combine all of the institutional holdings, including government, it's about 4 million coins, but the total amount is 20 million.
What you can run locally is getting better and better. So we're running into another phase of the AI world.
It's mostly 50 Bitcoin at a time. So it's thousands and thousands of wallets. And so if there's an attack, we'll start seeing those coins move.
Lineshine is coming in at 2.2 exaflops and 64 bits, which is about 20% more than the previous number one.
The job of generating code seems to be, I wouldn't say it's completely solved, but I think we've got models now that can reliably build pretty complex things.
I think there are three broad things that get discussed. And one is the core business, which is Starlink in the case of SpaceX, but more generally, low Earth orbit.
So a 90 to 95% CAGR to reach $1 trillion in revenue in 4 years.
You have to get to temperatures of 100 million degrees. The sun's at 15 million.
Welcome to the Orion X Download Podcast. Join Shaheen Khan, the Orion X analysts, and special guests as they discuss and simplify the big ideas in technology that are changing the world. Thank you for being with us.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Orion X Download Analyst RoundTable podcast. This is the 14th episode of the fondly referred to ART episode. We have another full house today. With me today is Chris Krull, Adrian Cockcroft, and Stephen Perrineau. Great to have you, gentlemen.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, good to see you again.
This time we're going to talk about HPC. There's a new top 500, crypto. Dr. Steve has a new crypto super 500 report, quantum safe cryptography, AI, chips, space, and a bit of fusion as well. So without further ado, let's talk about HPC and the new top 500. Steve, Adrian, you guys had read about this. Chris?
Yeah, you were the expert with plenty to talk about in this one.
Okay. Okay, so then I'll get it started because I've been looking at it. Net, there is a surprising new number one on the top 500 list that was introduced at the International Supercomputing Conference in Hamburg, Germany on the 23rd of June. This is the day we are recording this podcast. And that is a Chinese system called Lineshine. Now, China had famously stopped participating in the top 500 list for nearly a decade, starting in 2017. At the time, the analysis, the conjecture was that they had stopped participating because they were doing pretty well, and they did not want to kind of muddy the water with trade negotiations that were going on at that time. Let's just keep that aside and not flaunt it. But then they kind of stopped participating even after that. Now the conjecture is that having done that for about almost 10 years, maybe there's no downside anymore. So Lineshine is coming in at 2.2 exaflops and 64 bits, which is about 20% more than the previous number one, the El Capitan system at the Department of Energy in the US. And this one is a custom chip locally, and it's running a local version of Linux that originally started in the military. It's got 304 cores per chip. It's an ARM v9 core, so it's got the tool chains and the compilers and such. And obviously, to get the kind of performance that you're getting, it's pretty common in the supercomputing world to claim manual control on memory placement and buffering and overlapping communication with computation and try to really optimize the heck out of things, which you can do. So the chip really either bypasses or doesn't even offer automatic management of anything. So it's kind of a cashless system. They call it a scratch pad rather than a cache. Vector registers were kind of like that. And if you look at the history of top 500, there have been several systems that have been like that. Cray systems, the original Seymour Cray vector supercomputers, were all vector registers, no virtual memory, no caches, word addressability to just do everything possible to optimize for performance. And then you had the IBM Roadrunner supercomputer based on the Cell technology, the gaming chip that they did with Toshiba and Sony, but they had a server version that they used for this. And then the Japanese Earth simulator, which was an absolute, like a slam dunk in its time. It was like 4 times faster than the nearest system and retained number one for quite a while. That was an NEC vector implementation. And then the last time this sort of made such a news was another Chinese system called the Sunway Taiyu Light. I think at the time we used to joke that you should call it tail light because that's the only part of it you're going to see. And it also was a pretty formidable performance at the time, and it retained number one for a couple of times. And now we have Lion Shine. So Lion Shine was in fact announced, or at least had media coverage, a few months ago, back in April timeframe, and then again in May timeframe. And at that time, it was positioned as an ambitious project in at least two phases. Phase one was done, phase two was going to come, and phase two was going to be the 2 exaflop implementation. So the vibes that I got, and perhaps others, was that this was going to be like a 2027 kind of a phenomenon. So for them to have actually assembled the system, run the benchmark, submitted it, get it accepted within a couple of months of that media coverage is pretty interesting. So net, very interesting system. It's all CPU, so it's looking a little bit more general purpose than the last one that they did, which also was all CPU, but the computational part seemed a little bit more special purpose. And this one has HBM on the chip as well, which points to the kind of bandwidth and latency and kind of the capabilities that exist on the chip. So it all looks like something that should be taken seriously, and we'll see what results are published that we can get to see. There's at least one paper that they published that is focused on AI workloads, and it does mixed precision as well, albeit not as strongly as, let's say, El Capitan does. There's another benchmark on the top 500 called HPL for high performance slim pack, MXP for mixed precision, which typically gets on the order of 9 to 11 times the speed compared to the 64-bit, getting the same answers through a different algorithm. In the case of Lion Shine, it gets something like 4x. So why is it getting a lot less? That could be partly because it is a CPU-based system, partly because of how the mixed precision stuff is implemented. But nevertheless, all told, pretty formidable system, pretty big achievement, and it has definitely caused a lot of excitement in the supercomputing world as China re-enters the race in a very strong way.
Did they say what the customer installation is for? Like weather forecasting or computational or whatever, or is it just the sort of manufacturer of the system talking about anything they built?
It was attributed to a cloud provider in Shenzhen, and that also points to how it got funded and how it came about. It's a Huawei system. It obviously is SMIC, local chip manufacturing company's chips. It's running at 1.55 gigahertz ARM v9 cores. So it is that class of a system. But obviously, because China does things in such a substantially different way than the Western world, it's hard to tell how much of it is the civil.
Well, the name of it is the National Supercomputing Center in Shenzhen. So my interpretation is that the Shenzhen Cloud Computing Center Limited is providing this service for the National Supercomputing Center in Shenzhen. That would be the way the things they do it. It's in the research segment, so it's there as a national, just like the old NSF supercomputer centers most likely is the kind of model.
Right. Well, where I was going was that it's hard to tell how much of it is military and how much of it is civil research, etc.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, next topic is crypto. Dr. Steve, speaking of supercomputing, you have your semi-annual Crypto Super report that was just published. Take us through it a little bit.
Yes, well, it's timely. This is the 16th Crypto Supercomputer 500 report that we've published as OrionX. We do it twice a year, and we do it in conjunction with the major supercomputing conferences. So we do it around the same time that the new top 500 lists come out, because those also come out twice a year. And so our name is somewhat aligned with that. We don't have a list of 500 systems. What we have is a race, and that race is basically partially countries, how much Bitcoin mining power they have, but increasingly it's also been companies, because there are a number of publicly traded companies. So we have now a 7.5-year perspective on this. The other component of the race is, of course, between coins. Now, we only consider things that are supercomputing in nature, high performance computing. And that means that the solution to the consensus algorithm, what's generally called a class of Byzantine fault tolerance algorithms, has to have real work. It has to have proof of work. It has to have substantial, quote unquote, supercomputer levels of computation. And the only consensus algorithm that's way is proof of work. And then we also put a bar, so we only consider coins that have a certain market cap. And it turns out for proof of work, there are only half a dozen, actually 7 coins that reach 1 billion market cap. But the next bar we put is how much annual mining or minting production they have. And only 3 coins make the cut. And of course, always Bitcoin has been in the lead. In the past, Ethereum has been around and been very significant, but they abandoned proof of work in 2022, as I recall, several years ago. So they've been off the list for some time as they migrated to proof of stake with Ethereum 2.0. The vast majority of coins out there in the crypto world are proof of stake or some other sort of consensus algorithm that's more about voting. So really, they use minimal amounts of computer hardware. The ones that make the cut are Bitcoin, of course, and Dogecoin is number 2, and the third one that makes the cut is Zcash. With the current pricing, collectively, the annual economic minting value of Bitcoin on this list that we just published last week in conjunction with the ISC supercomputing conference that's going on this week in Hamburg is 11 billion at the price that we had last week. It's about 10 billion per year at the current price. So it's in that range, 10 to 11 billion. You get a little bit from fees, but fees are pretty cheap now. They're only about 1%. So that adds of order 100 million or so to the revenue of the mining and minting companies that are, of course, spread out around the world. This is a world's largest globally decentralized supercomputer. The amount that you get from Dogecoin and from Zcash is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Collectively between them, they're less than $1 billion. So you've got something like a $12 billion annual production. If you want to make a comparison to traditional supercomputing, if you start to look at the architecture, the traditional supercomputers based around either this kind of a vector CPU that we see in Lineshine, or with the many systems out there that use GPUs, they're just able to run at very, very low hashing rates relative to the highly customized ASIC chips that have been developed over the past 12 years or so. Bitcoin started out with CPU mining, then switched to GPUs, and then there was some work with FPGAs, but they transitioned to ASICs in 2013, and it's been a very rapid development. They're very highly parallelized, very highly pipelined, and they're stripped down, somewhat like this vector architecture. They pipeline the whole process, and you do one hash, it's actually 1,600 logical and bit manipulation operations. There's no floating point. And it turns out if you took the previous number 1, which was the El Capitan at Livermore Labs, Department of Energy, 1.8 exaflops, that's only the equivalent of about 2 to 4 of the modern mining rigs. And the whole Bitcoin network is 1 million times larger than that. And Shineline would be of the same order, possibly a little bit faster. But we're talking really 1 million times slower for the fastest supercomputers in the world compared to what you get out of the total Bitcoin network. A couple of other highlights. Mostly the coins are still held by the public, but there's increasing ownership by corporations, ETFs, which are funds, really trading vehicles that at the end of the day are mostly owned by retail. And then there's some government holdings. So if you combine all of the institutional holdings, including government, it's about 4 million coins, but the total amount is 20 million. So it's still largely in retail hands. As far as the distribution of the hashing power, which is now a zeta hash, which is 1,000 times exa. So we're in the zeta scale rather than the exa scale that the top 500 people are in. Again, very customized, and so it's possible to do that. That is distributed around millions of mining machines. The US is number 1 since the Chinese ban several years ago. But it looks like China and Russia are number 2 and 3, China by a little bit. So we've got something like 30% of the mining power in the US. And then in the teens kind of percentage for Russia and China. Together, those three nations are about 60% of the minting and mining power. Within the US, it's primarily publicly traded companies. In fact, the top 10 publicly traded and venture capital funded companies have about 280 exahashes of hash rate. So that's already 28% of the total network just in those 10 companies. The other most important trend that I'll mention as I wrap it up is that the increasing amount of insertion into the grid for load balancing. So it's becoming more and more active. We see that particularly in Texas, which is the largest mining facility. And then the final point is that these publicly traded companies are all entering into AI and HPC hosting in order to stabilize their revenues. And because they've been operating at the energy frontier with very low cost, scalable infrastructure, they've got the footprint. They need to swap in GPUs for AI and HPC workload. And they're doing that to round out their offerings. And some of them have made rather large deals with some of the largest cloud providers, including Microsoft, Azure, and so forth.
Well, one thing about crypto is the whole threat of quantum safe cryptography or quantum computing cracking the code. We've talked a little bit about this in the past in terms of the hashing as well as the actual encryption. What's the latest on that?
The latest is that the Bitcoin community was getting very nervous because there's been some advances in quantum computing space on the algorithmic side and on the noise management side. The basic thing people have to understand is that you need a very large number of handler qubits for every logical qubit. So you have many, many physical qubits to get a handful of logical qubits. In fact, if you take the Willow chip from Google, it's of order 90 physical qubits, and at best you can get 1, 2, or 3 logical qubits out of that system. And so there's a lot of work on trying to improve that ratio and handle noise better. And there have been some advances. And so this has worried people that the threat to elliptic curve cryptography and RSA at the 256-bit level, might be moving in. But even with the latest observations, one needs from 500,000 to 1 million or more physical qubits in order to get 1,000 or so logical qubit system based on what we know today. And at that level, you can start to break SHA-256 and perhaps do it even within the 10-minute window of a single block, because most of the Bitcoin, the addresses, the public key is only exposed on the fly. And so you've got to break it while it's sitting in the memory pool of transactions. There is a lot of older Bitcoin that's been dormant, such as Satoshi's Bitcoin, that have exposed public key addresses. And so that's sitting there as a honeypot, and that's going to be our warning. Now, it's not all, the million Bitcoin that Satoshi has is not all in one place. It's mostly 50 Bitcoin at a time. So it's thousands and thousands of wallets. And so if there's an attack, we'll start seeing those coins move. So that's what's happening in terms of the threats to the entire financial system, because it all rests on this sort of public-private key cryptography. But the other thing that's more imminent, really, is the requirements that are happening that are being promulgated by, for example, the NSA, which says that on January 1st of 2027, their algorithmic suite 2.0 requires that new acquisitions for national security systems be compliant unless, they get some waiver, and that non-compliant equipment has to be phased out by the end of 2030. And there are other directives. There's a directive that says that FIPS 140 by 21 September is going to move to historical status, and that creates a procurement cliff. France's National Security Agency announced it from 2027. They'll stop certifying security products that lack quantum-resistant encryption. And the problem is that we've got decades and decades of ownership and identity and software provenance and settlement instructions. And of course, just the browser certificates, right?
Yeah.
And nobody's compliant with quantum, even on the certificates that the browser is supposed to present. So there's this other huge challenge that's really staring us in the face, which is how we migrate decades of activity for decades into the future.
Yeah, so as you're talking about this, I've seen headlines about Mythos and Project Glasswing just crushing secure infrastructure. Have you thought about this? Has anybody else thought about how that is well, to me, it just accelerates the need for quantum proof. But can you speak to that a little bit?
I don't know that I can. Maybe you can, Adrian. One of the problems is that the quantum signatures are heavyweight relative. The classic elliptical curve signature is 64 bytes. And these post-quantum signatures are 2420 byte, 1312 public key. Other variants have 4600 bytes per signature. So it's much heavier to implement, and we don't know how it's going to affect the internet infrastructure and performance. So that's one challenge, but the other challenge is this immediate challenge that we're facing, that we've just seen this, this immediate clampdown and ban, right?
Yeah.
So they're running scared.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the Mythos and Fable 5 issue where they took it away, I don't think it's related to the sort of cracking of core encryption algorithms. It's just able to find all of the buffer overflows and unprotected API endpoints and stupid things that have crept in over the years. There's lots and lots of ways into software if you're persistent. I did a bit of testing while it was still available. I have this software I built called Retort. It's on my GitHub account, adrianco/retort. Lets you just build comparisons of different permutations. So I've been testing different versions of agents over different languages, different prompts, different easy and harder tasks. The thing I found from Opus 4.6 was, it was still struggling here and there. 4.7, it basically took a lot longer, but it started getting good. 4.8, reliably just basically my benchmark saturated. With 4.8, regardless of language, it would just build the hard thing you wanted. Built as a build from scratch, but it's a fairly complex task to go build. And then when I tried Fable 5, it gave me the same answers, just cost more, because I'd saturated the benchmark. I think this is something that's pervasive in the industry. If we look at what's happening now, we're finding that the models that you can run locally are starting to get good enough to replace some of the activity that you would be using a frontier model for. So if you've got a piece of work which the frontier models are saturating on, they're not the newer models, that you can basically use Sonnet or something. And I think one of the things that really changed was that they moved to a 1 million token window context from whatever it was, 200K. That seems to have made more difference almost than anything else, because now Sonnet has a 1 million token window and it's doing better at these coding jobs. So the latest version of Retort set up to run local models, but I didn't have enough memory on the machine. I had 24 gig of RAM on the machine I was trying it on. So I've just put in an order for a 64 gigabyte machine so I can run some of the slightly bigger models. There's a model called GLM 5.2 that's currently people are saying is basically as good as Opus at coding, but you need about maybe 200 gig size model to run it. So if you've got a fairly large system like a Mac with 256 gig of RAM in it, you can run that locally. But this, I think, is a transition that we're going to be going through in the next few months, as we're seeing that the cloud systems are unreliable. They're expensive. You can run it locally. What you can run locally is getting better and better. So we're running into another phase of the AI world where more and more things can be run locally reliably now, just literally on the machine you're using as a developer. So this is really focused on the development space. And there's a lot more other stuff going on as well. But I think that effectively the job of generating code seems to be, I wouldn't say it's completely solved, but I think we've got models now that can reliably build pretty complex things.
So there are a few things happening in the world of AI that I think are very significant. One is the move from training to inference, which I have likened to online transaction processing for AI, with all the dynamics and capacity planning and cost and responsiveness and all the other parameters that were really important for OLTP in the mainframe world that are going to come back and be relevant again. Now you have to include the cost of every click because you're introducing it to all of your customer service agents around the world, let's say. The second one is a move away from GPUs to CPUs with having accelerators on chip or otherwise try to lower the cost that way. And then the third thing, like you mentioned, is local processing versus cloud processing to, again, make the cost a little bit more tractable and predictable. And then finally, for me, is the move towards fewer bits. We've gone from 64 bits to 32 to 16 to 8 to 4. And now, in fact, there was a group out of Caltech that is providing 1-bit capability. And of course, they do that by kind of tricks and factoring things out and, trying to have still the kind of range that they do. But in fact, it seems to be quite okay. So they can do quite a few tokens per second, even just on your iPhone, sort of a thing. So I think we are poised for another step function in AI within the next 12 months or so, outside of just model capability, just the infrastructure part.
I'm curious about that third one, about how we think that's going to impact the revenue projections for the AI industry if people can run locally substantial models, whether it be for code development or for any back office sorts of applications.
Well, let's just say Mr. Jevons is doing quite a bit of heavy lifting in this world.
Mm-hmm.
So we are counting on lower cost, unlocking more demand than it reduces in terms of revenue.
But I think if you think you're going to take over a market, what's happening is the market for the AI vendors is being continually undermined as they go. So they are going to have the frontier market, which they can command as they get able to do new things. But it's not like they have a profitable base to build that off of. The frontiers are sort of unprofitable because you're throwing a lot of compute and you're generally subsidizing it. And in a normal business, you'd be backfilling with a profitable market that you've already built underneath. So if that profitable market keeps disappearing on them, it's going to be hard for them to continue.
I think they need to IBMize, if you know what I mean by that. Shaheen, I think you do, which is, have all the services and training and solutions expertise built around the offering in order to make it a profitable, focused enterprise agentic business.
Of course, the whole industry hasn't quite got to let's become more efficient. Right now, everybody just wants the capability at any cost. Let's have a seat at the table at any cost.
I think we're moving on from that, though. There's been a lot more talk in the last few months about cost optimization and token maxing being, people are basically trying to get everyone to use it, and then they started overusing it, and now they're pulling it back and trying to get into the point where, you spend a few $100K a year on a software developer salary and you're spending more than that on tokens. That doesn't make sense, right? So they're trying to figure out how do they get better cost efficiency. And one of the things I'm doing in Retort is it basically says, if for a fixed problem, which language should you use and which model should you use? And what it tells you is how long it takes to generate the answer, how many tokens and how much money that is, right? And you could spend, $5 getting an answer or $20 getting an answer just by picking a different language and a different model. And the point is that you want to find the combination that works best. And, and the short answer, if you just want to go and do something efficiently, is Go seems to be a pretty efficient language, the most efficient language from a token use and time and reliability point of view, just because it's a very well-structured language that doesn't have a lot of variations. You tend to get the same thing built almost every time. Whereas if you use Python or TypeScript, you get randomly different code each time you build it, and with different bugs and stuff like that. So there's something about optimizing the problem against the solution there.
Speaking of language, and as a way to cleverly segue into space, XAI announced that they're doing everything in C, their entire development in C. What do we think about that approach? And they're doing it for performance reasons. Is that going to make them competitive?
I mean, if you look at the sort of the NVIDIA stack all down in CUDA, it's, quote, in C++. But if you actually read the code, it's in C with a little bit of C++ sort of wrappers around the edge. The actual fast stuff, it's C code with, every now and again, there's something that's a little bit more complex. So that's true for the raw underlying code thing. But if you're trying to solve a business problem, you're not going to do that in C. I think it makes sense for the underlying libraries that are run lots and lots of times where you want to get the last little bit of performance out of it.
So performance and resource usage, that's one axis of concern about trying to get to these huge projections of revenue that these companies are going to hit. We also need to be thinking about the quality coming out of our AI related work, as well as is there a real pushback amongst people about the usage of AI, and what are those implications against the very large projections that companies are putting out there to warrant their large valuations?
Yeah, there's definitely some pushback in some areas. We're getting, even the people that were pushing back pretty hard 6 months or a year ago are going, okay, I can use this. They're using AI to get things done, and it's more about managing it to get a good outcome right now. But this is moving again month by month, right? Over the last 2 or 3 months, we've had several versions of models getting significantly better. And the going back to the fable mythos issue, what I saw was that it's just very persistent at getting to the answer you want, which is nice in some respects. But if the answer you want is break into this website or find the bugs in this code, it's very good at doing that. Somebody else left it running to solve some code problem or find a bug, fix a bug, and the thing took over its machine, built a web browser so that it could, whatever, right? You say you're not allowed to use a web browser. It can build a web browser, right? So it just built it built all of this infrastructure and tooling just so that it could go and figure out how it was trying to recreate the bug situation. So it was trying to create the environment that would make this bug happen so it could tell whether it had fixed it or not. And it was just much too persistent. It didn't have the judgment to know when to stop. And I think that's kind of why the mythos fable level is maybe dangerous at some level, is that it doesn't have that, okay, I should stop now kind of thing built into it. And some kind of guardrail that's missing there that they tried putting in when they built Fable 5, but certainly there were some areas there where it's good. So I think what you want to do is build code with a cheap model that's quick, and then review it with a better model that goes and criticizes it and analyzes it, and maybe runs the tests and things like that. So there's kind of some model variations and different things we can do there.
But in terms of security, it is impossible to tell the difference between a reasonable ethical command and the exact command that's going to be used for unethical purposes. Like, please find all the security holes in this piece of code because I am the owner of the code and I'm trying to fix it, or because I'm trying to hack into this code. So please help me do that.
Yeah. It's like the human job of a security researcher has now been, that expertise has now pretty much been overtaken by AI. That's kind of what's happened. Like, we were limited by the humans that were doing this research, and now we're able to do it with a tool that is better than them. So maybe we can take all our systems as we build it and put in a tool which is Fable, Mythos, whatever based, which is making sure that what we built is secure. And that should be the practice going forward.
And by the way, that is what has been used in terms of the risks of AI in the future, is to do the analogy with human beings. That 3,000 years ago, you were like living in caves, and now you're going to the moon. How did that happen? So just like that, as soon as you know how to plan, and as soon as you know how to relentlessly pursue an objective and navigate around it to achieve it, you're going to do unpredictably interesting, incredible things.
The problem is the rate of change, though. And there's a paper that I'm working on that's going to be published in September or so from IT Revolution, Gene Kim's IT Revolution group. We write papers every summer. The one I'm working on with a small team is on agentic continuous decision intelligence. So this is replacing management decision-making functions with AI models, not coding, not whatever, but basically deciding how to run a business, optimizing supply chains and those kinds of things. And historically, we've got very good at optimizing predictable supply chains like agriculture, manufacturing, sales and distribution, that kind of stuff. The models are relatively stable. And you can go buy big modules from SAP that will do that kind of stuff. So that's the province of ERP. And then if you look at what's happening right now, it's completely chaotic. Those models don't work because you've got tariffs appearing and disappearing, wars happening, pandemics and things, the sort of supply chain shocks. So you have to, even if you're automating it, you have to build a level of automation that is agile and is building in buffers against these shocks. But not, if you build in too much buffer and the shock doesn't happen, then you'll be out of business because you're inefficient. So there's this trade-off between building something's efficient and building something that will survive. And in a chaotic environment, what we're seeing is a higher priority right now on, can you survive the random things that are happening? And the rate of change of AI is another survival thing that's happening to companies.
Very, very interesting. Let's go to space. You guys touched on it. SpaceX went public. We talked about it last time around. What do you all think about that entire area, space area, volume? Yeah.
Well,
I think there are three broad things that get discussed. And one is the core business, which is Starlink in the case of SpaceX, but in more generally low Earth orbit. And then you have to also consider medium Earth orbit and geo and sun synchronous and polar. But basically, Earth orbit and everything you can do in terms of communications, serving communications, but also Earth sensing, right? And you need the higher orbits can be better for Earth sensing. And the polar orbits are very critical as well for those. So all those have a future. The growth in the low Earth orbit is about 9% between now and 2035. So it's not enormously rapid growth, but it's fast growth relative to GDP. So there's that. Then there's the two very highly speculative things. And we talked some, I think, last time about the data center in space and all of the challenges around that. And it just doesn't seem to make sense for most applications between lift costs and having to protect against radiation and the difficulties of getting heat out where you have to have very large radiator fins and so forth. So that's extremely speculative. And the other one that's very speculative, of course, is whether it's the moon or asteroids or even Mars, the establishment of industry, mining, and so forth, colonies even. The mining really is going to be primarily for things that you need in space. So you're going to mine for water, you're going to mine for fuel. You're not going to be mining for gold. You're not going to Psyche because there's a lot of gold potentially there and mining gold and shipping that back to Earth because it's far too expensive to get the equipment to the moon, much less to Psyche. And, people talk about helium-3, maybe at some point. But really what's going to matter when you eventually do mining, and it's decades out, it's going to be to create fuel for water. And then for materials, that regolith that you're going to use as material for actually building things on the surface of the moon itself.
There's still no planet B, so to say.
There's no planet B. There's no transistor planet.
Yeah. So in terms of the SpaceX launch, the most significant thing they did almost immediately was close the acquisition of Cursor, I think for $60 billion as a share swap. They teed that up in advance by doing a deal with them that said they could buy them later. So they pulled the pin on that one. And the stock price went up a bit and it's now come down a bit and it's obviously bouncing around. And, when you hear this, it will probably have changed again. But it's doing the usual thing of immediately after an IPO, you get a spike and then it comes down. And then probably the big measure will be on the first quarterly, actual announcement of their results. Are they on a track? Because what's built into the price is the expectation of basically exceeding whatever guidance they've given. And the guidance is extremely aggressive. So if they start doing just like a normal level of business growth, that will be that's worth much less than the current market price. So there's a bunch of more negative sentiment out there and analysts saying this is not worth its current value. The other thing that's been floated, and we'll just see how soon it might happen, is that to merge Tesla and SpaceX into one company. So we could see if that's the other sort of large thing that could happen, if you like. But there was seems some speculation around. But I think it's the normal path here is that the stock price continues to gradually fall. There's probably unlikely to exceed its goals in the quarterly results, and it'll end up being closer to what the inherent value of the company is at some point.
So I see a lot of these things as a really high-end, sophisticated combination of engineering, and financial engineering. And as I like to say, as a valid form of engineering, both of them, when you combine the two, you can do a lot of stuff that is going to work at the end of the day, even though it might look iffy to one side or the other. And as a result, there's a narrative and there's a structure behind it that makes it work. And whether it does long term or not becomes a different issue.
So a 90 to 95% CAGR to reach $1 trillion in revenue in 4 years, that's pretty interesting. Do we get there with both forms of engineering, or are we just wanting to hear the narrative and therefore buy in?
Well, if you go merge Tesla, or if you go do other acquisitions, or if you kind of keep shifting the target, you might be able to rearrange things, right?
Yeah, I guess I hadn't accounted for in my view, the merger is a done deal, but I hadn't figured on additional acquisition.
But if it's
you're not getting the growth
yeah.
from Tesla, and you're not getting the growth
Yeah.
from the Starlink business. I mean, it's a healthy,
Right.
nice business, but to get those sorts of very, very high double-digit CAGRs, it's got to come from AI. It was like 80 to 90% predicated on AI,
Yeah.
right?
It's basically a telco and possibly a car business doesn't justify this current pricing, right? So they have to succeed in AI, and it's not one of the main AI platforms by any means.
That's
and
right.
that they have to see if they can make it into that. And then we've got, teeing up, I guess, Anthropic next, and then OpenAI, which are the actual platforms. And Anthropic, I think, is the one that's got more of a valid business case behind it being a pure play AI that's doing very well. And OpenAI has a few more issues, but it's, again, both of those, I think, are much more reasonable AI plays.
So this time it took us 40 some minutes to get to this is not investment advice. Yeah. Your mileage will vary. And none of this is an endorsement or etc. It's just a technology analysis. But let's bring it to a close. Any comments on fusion energy?
Don't invest. So
even though that's not advice.
So, the joke about fusion, and it kind of applies to quantum computing too, is that it's always a decade away. And that's been the joke since
Long
the early
time.
1980s, when we were installing Cray systems out at the Magnetic Fusion Energy Lab. Mm-hmm. So I recently watched a podcast that was held by the MIT class of 71, which is the class 1 year before mine. And they had 3 physics grads who went on to get their PhDs in physics focused on nuclear fusion from MIT and from Princeton. And then they worked their entire careers in the fusion industry at the Princeton Plasma Lab and with ITER, which is the largest international collaboration for fusion, and in the German project, and in some other labs. They had long careers. Some of them rose to be directors of those labs. So these were very senior people. There are 3 types of fusion. There's magnetic confinement, which is what most people have heard of, and the tokamak idea. There's inertial confinement. People have heard about that because of the National Ignition Facility at Livermore Labs, which uses lasers to implode a pellet. And then there are hybrid designs, and the most interesting hybrid designs are hybrid between accelerators and the magnetic confinement tokamak, where you basically set up plasma at 2 ends and smash it in the 2 plasma balls into each other, and they generate their own magnetic fields and confine themselves. The thing all dates back to 1969 with the tokamak program. They have achieved, close to scientific break even at the magnetic fusion lab, 0.6 with tokamak kind of technology, traditional technology, and then at the National Ignition Facility, they're now up to a ratio of 4. But you have to go from scientific to engineering to commercial. And it turns out that there's something like, for the National Ignition Facility, there was about 100 times as much energy going into the lasers, electrical energy. So engineering break even would be almost 2 orders of magnitude higher than scientific break even. You have to get to temperatures of 100 million degrees. The sun's at 15 million. But the sun has a higher density and a lot more matter to work with, and it's been doing it for billions of years. So you need much higher temperatures than the sun, and it's exponentially sensitive to the temperature because you're tunneling through the quantum barrier, you're smashing protons together that are pushing each other apart through they both have positive charges, so they repel each other, the Coulomb barrier. The state of things today at ITER is this international consortium. Everybody's in it, even the Russians, US, Chinese, everybody's in it. It's an 18-meter by 9-meter tokamak, deuterium, tritium, which is a standard fuel, 15 kilovolt, 500-second goal for containment of operating plasma. At Oak Ridge, they have something. It's smaller. It's only a megaton instead of the 23 megatons at the one in France, the International Consortium. The reason why they got this cooperation between all these nations dates all the way back to meetings between Reagan and Gorbachev in the 1980s. So the initial cooperation was actually between the US and the Soviets, and then France, and then other partners in Europe, and then Japan. By the early 2000s, China, Korea, and India had all joined. The first operation is expected in the mid-2030s, and that would be a goal of some sort of engineering break-even. You've got a plasma, you've got a blanket around it to capture neutrons and also to breed fuel because you need to create tritium. Tritium is extremely scarce. Deuterium is very common in seawater, but tritium has a short half-life, and so you've got to breed it. And you do it by capturing the neutrons in the blanket. And then some of that energy from the neutrons that are produced go into, heating a conventional generator with steam heating. A bunch of private companies have sprung up, particularly in the past 5 years or so, and they've got funding of $10 billion, quite a bit. One of the most important ones is an MIT spinoff called Commonwealth. They've got $3 billion of investment. They're running a very large magnet, high temperature superconducting magnet technology. We're expecting some net fusion power into the grid in the 30s and 40s, the 20s, 30s, and 40s, not the ones in the past that we tend to think of. There's a lot of science and technology that has to be resolved and trying to scale up. And, one of the speakers was more skeptical. He said, we're going to need to be out in the 2040s and the 2050s to have something that's engineering break even, being operated, maybe government subsidized, maybe really still not commercial break even. So that's kind of the state of play.
Excellent.
Well, there's one more thing. There's a company called Helion that claims to be building a fusion reactor. They've got permission to start building it. That was news about a week ago. And they claim to be generating 50 megawatts of power in 2028. They haven't published any peer review papers on how it works, but
they're hybrid. So they're one of the ones where what's interesting about this technology is attractive, and some people are using other fuels besides deuterium and tritium, like boron and so forth. But helium smash like an accelerator together. They generate the magnetic field internally. It combines it inside the walls because you can't touch the walls, right? But then the nice thing is it induces a current externally. And so you don't have to go through the process of heating up steam. You directly induce electric current.
So that hybrid system seems plausible. Do you think they're actually got something that's going to work?
It's plausible. I've written about that. There are others that are using that technique. It's certainly worth pursuing. And it all comes down to keeping the plasma stable for long lifetimes, right? That's the problem, because this stuff, it wants to leak this way and that way. And if it touches the walls, you've got catastrophe, right? So you need to create a stable field.
So is it fusion or is it really a different thing?
It's fusion.
Right.
It's using acceleration to get high density and magnetic confinement and to have fusion occur in the combined beam.
Right. So that seems like that's the short-term commercializable way of doing fusion, right?
Well, the commercial companies are all a little more optimistic than these scientists who have experience back to 1971, 50 years of physics experience and observation. So when you hear from the CEO of one of these startups that's getting hundreds of millions of billions and has to raise new money, they're a little more optimistic. So the Commonwealth fusion people are traditional, but they've got some nice magnet technology, superconducting magnet technology. There are half a dozen of these companies that are doing interesting things with different approaches, sometimes different fuels like boron. They're all worth pursuing now because we don't really know what's going to work and be both engineering and commercially successful.
We'll find out fairly soon whether the Helion one works or not.
All right, maybe on that energetic note, we can conclude this one. Thank you all for listening. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Until next time.
Cheers.
That's it for this episode of the OrionX Download Podcast. Every episode is posted to orionx.net and shared on social media. Use the comments section or tweet us with any questions or proposed topics of discussion. If you like the show, rate, review, and share it. The OrionX Download Podcast is a production of OrionX. Thank you for listening.